Hey guys, Kinoflex here, back with another review. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the new Superman movie to come out, which has received a lot of hype around it, not simply for being about one of the most popular superheroes ever, but for also being the start of a new DC cinematic universe headed by James Gunn. So you have a lot of people incredibly invested in seeing this movie and how it performs, because its success will decide the direction newer DC films will take. Naturally, the film has a lot of lifelong fans of Superman who will line up to see it because they love the character. But it also has its fair share of detractors, which mainly come in the form of disgruntled Zack Snyder fans whose vision of both Superman and the DC Universe didn't exactly take off. And I find this whole feud between the fan bases to be very funny, considering James Gunn and Zack Snyder don't even hate each other and actually seem to be on friendly terms with one another. But then it started to get more detractors after James Gunn became vocal about potential political allegories he apparently inserted into the film, which drew some ire. And I'm going to address it, but if you're not interested and simply want to hear my thoughts on the movie, then please skip to the timestamp provided. There's an overarching theme in the film relating to Superman coming from Krypton, and James Gunn supposedly tries to make it a message about the virtues of immigration. And as an allegory, some are taking it to mean Superman is an immigrant, so that means all immigrants are good, including illegal immigrants, because Superman is good. Therefore, we should have open borders. Economic and security concerns are not real because borders are just social constructs. And it's a very weird message to put out because Superman is more American than he is Kryptonian, as all of his morals came from America, specifically his parents in Kansas, not Krypton. So in that sense, you can't really say that it's an illegal immigrant story since Clark Kent was never raised on Krypton and is ultimately just spreading the values of America and not where he originally came from. His motto is literally truth, justice, and the American way. It's impossible to deny that his roots are inherently American. So when someone says that Superman sees himself as more Kryptonian than human, that's just a huge misconception on the same level as saying that Batman is simply a billionaire who gets off on punching poor people instead of donating to charity to actually help Gotham. Another distinction you can make is that he's obviously a refugee that became a naturalized citizen after getting adopted by citizens since he crash landed on Earth, and isn't an economic migrant like the vast majority of immigrants that are both legal and illegal. If some American couple adopted a baby not born in the country and they grew up without knowing they were adopted until they became a teenager, that is in no way comparable to people crossing the border illegally as adults. By US law, any child under the age of 18 is given citizenship if they have parents who are already citizens. Sometimes, depending on the story, Clark isn't even filed as adopted but a home birth. So with all this taken into consideration, Clark Kent is legally an American citizen, so therefore his made-up persona Superman is too. But even if you want to say that Superman is an illegal immigrant, what point do you think you're making exactly? That every immigrant is equivalent to Superman, including the violent criminals? Well, even if him being an illegal immigrant were the case, a heroic Superman would still not agree with open borders, immigrants refusing to assimilate, or not punishing illegal immigrants who commit crimes, as several of Superman's decades worth of story shows us that him allowing open borders violates his own moral code. Superman, or anyone else for that matter, forcing countries to accept illegal immigrants against their will is evil. It's literally, unironically evil for the exact same reason someone forcing you to let strangers inside your own home would be evil. It would be just as evil as allowing Darkseid's cronies from the alien planet of Apocalypse to come and wreak havoc on Earth. People have a right to not let other people live with them. It's a fundamental human right. And also, how is comparing Superman to all immigrants not just as much of a reductive generalization when discussing illegal immigration? Because just like how not all illegal immigrants are violent criminals that provide nothing to the country, not all illegal immigrants are good people who assimilate and perform certain jobs that are necessary for the country they're in. If you want to evaluate someone on if they deserve to be in the country, you need to evaluate them as an individual with certain characteristics and traits. You need to establish how they got into the country, what they're planning to do in the country, and if them even being in the country is good for anyone and not just themselves. Something else that's also worth addressing is that calling yourself or referring to someone else as only being an immigrant is not something deserving of either praise or scorn, because it's a mostly meaningless term when you think about it. All it means is a person going from one place to another place to live. That's it. It's such an incredibly broad term that it can refer to both good and bad people depending on the context, as it can refer to any person or group on the planet, or in Superman's case, the entire universe. It's why I get really annoyed when someone says that a certain accomplishment or tragedy should be credited to immigrants broadly, when really they're referring to very specific groups of people and individuals who have specific cultures and beliefs compared to others who could also be called immigrants, which again is everyone. If someone says that you can't criticize an immigrant that's objectively a bad person because another separate person or groups of people are also immigrants who are by and large good people, it comes across as people making excuses for the bad apples by having them piggyback off the accomplishments of people who did things the right way. So when James Gunn, or really any writer for that matter, says that immigration is a good thing, it's meaningless because it can also be a bad thing that depends on the specific immigrant. And if you don't have border protections or a system in place to keep bad immigrants out, then you can't screen for immigrants with those good characteristics or virtues in the first place, and you'll just end up allowing immigrants who are just bad people into the country. If you're making immigration allegories with characters like Superman, it's very dishonest to have superheroes be framed as good immigrants when advocating for open border policies, and not have supervillains represent bad immigrants, which would justify not having an open border, which can describe most of Superman's rogues gallery that are alien threats looking to only cause harm. General Zod, for instance, is more of an actual immigrant than Superman is, and he's just pure evil. And even if we stick with the narrative of Superman being an immigrant, he could absolutely be described as an immigrant that actually assimilated into his new home, as he actively defends it from bad immigrants like Zod, who have no interest in assimilating, as most stories with him involve Superman deporting him back to the Phantom Zone. Superman is practically a superpowered ICE agent in this regard, so you can be for wanting immigrants like Superman into the country and still have strict standards in place for those wanting to immigrate. If you wanted to have a character who serves as an immigrant metaphor, you could just use Supergirl instead, because she actually grew up on Krypton and has to work towards assimilating on Earth, unlike her cousin Superman, who is already assimilated since he spent pretty much his entire life on Earth. The same applies to Martian Manhunter, who really needs to be given more stories considering he's strictly confined to stories with the Justice League. But the allegory just doesn't make sense for Superman. I don't even think James Gunn really thought about this analogy with Superman all that much, because nobody in the mainstream political arena is running on deporting all immigrants, just the bad ones. Not even racists are anti-immigration, as they would be perfectly fine with people that look like them immigrating into the country. I think he just has a dumb vendetta against conservatives because some of them gave him grief years ago by calling him a pedophile for telling edgy jokes, which he has every right to do, but that doesn't mean he made any sort of point here. But even though I talked about this at length, the immigrant subtext in the movie itself is actually a very small part of the film that was just blown way out of proportion by people who didn't even see the movie yet. It's not open borders propaganda by any means, regardless of what anyone on either political side will tell you. And if you ignored any of the media buzz around it, you honestly wouldn't pick up on it at all. When you look at the film for what it is, it's simply a pro-America message where Superman embraces the values he was actually raised on. With that out of the way, I want to give my thoughts on the rest of the movie. And while it isn't a super movie, it's still an entertaining movie. What you need to understand about this film is that it's unapologetically a James Gunn film, as it has a lot of the tropes you typically find in his other superhero movies. So if you're not a fan of the humor in the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy or the Suicide Squad, you're most likely going to come out of the theater for this having the same opinion as those other movies, whether it be positive or negative. But when it comes to simply telling a story about Superman, I would say it's pretty clumsy but gets the basics of the character right, which is more than can be said of other previous attempts made. An aspect I really appreciate about James Gunn's approach to these superhero movies is that, unlike a lot of other directors, he is in fact familiar with the source material and understands what makes these characters he's adapting so appealing to audiences. So that's why I disagree with those who dislike the film, because it's not a one-to-one adaptation of how things are supposed to be in the comics, as the creative decisions still highlight what makes Superman the hero he is in the comics. And before I elaborate, I just want to clarify that this is where I'm going to talk about spoilers from this point on. Throughout the movie, Superman gets challenged by Lex Luthor with not only physical threats, but also mental threats in attempts to ruin his public image as a hero, because there are stakes attached to how Superman is perceived. He's not merely a superhero, but a symbol that inspires everyone to be heroic themselves. It reminds me a lot of the underrated Legends comic storyline, and I would go so far to say that James Gunn was partially inspired by this storyline because there's a lot of similarities present with the overall conflict of villains trying to turn the public against superheroes. A lot of the people who complain about Superman getting his ass kicked, showing emotions, and needing help from other people strike me as those who fundamentally don't understand the character. Superman's defining quality is his restraint. It's not about how strong he is, but how weak he chooses to be depending on the context in order to respond to each situation with the appropriate amount of force to ensure the most peaceful outcome. Choosing not to utilize one's ability to do harm, even when they are justified to use it, is something people tend to struggle with. Because of this, it's Superman's capacity for restraint, not his capacity for harm, that makes him super, or punk rock, as the film likes to say. It also highlights how incredibly empathetic he is and how much he genuinely cares about other people. That's why I came out of the film really appreciating David Cornsweet's performance, because it really scratches that itch of having a faithful on-screen Superman. And I'm really confused as to how this portrayal is equivalent to gay, autistic, communist, pedophile propaganda that so many people online are proclaiming. Nicholas Hoult played Lex Luthor, and he is actually the highest paid actor in the entire movie, which may come across as a surprise because you would think the actor for Superman would be the one paid the most. But him being paid so much is justified because Hoult nailed the role of Luthor. All throughout the movie, he has this irritating presence of an arrogant scumbag trying to get Superman to crack. And because Superman's morals prevent him from kicking his ass, it really makes you want to see him get punched in the face. But him being able to evoke those emotions means that he did exactly what he was paid to do. The romantic chemistry between Clark and Lois was fantastic, because just like the myth of Superman never having to struggle in his stories, we also get a rebuttal to the myth that Lois Lane has no agency, or that she's just a damsel in distress, because the film does a good job of showing that she typically plays major roles that move the plot forward, or keeps Clark down to earth. The Justice Gang were really fun as supporting characters, and I'm glad that we have superheroes on the same side with different interpretations of ethics in the same movie. Hawk 2 Girl, for instance, just outright murders a guy in the same movie where Superman is saving dogs and squirrels. And since this is the first movie, they can expand on this in future stories. Guy Gardner is still an arrogant jock who takes himself ultra seriously, who along with Hawkgirl can be developed to be in conflict with Clark and each other over how to deal with threats. I also really found it funny how Mr. Terrific was essentially Mr. T as a superhero. But what impressed me the most about the film is also one of the most contentious things about it, which is the twist of making Superman's parents on Krypton intend for him to take over Earth, because his arc ends with him embracing his actual parents who raised him and to realize that he's more human than Kryptonian. I know a lot of people are angry over this decision, with some going so far as to say that it ruins Superman as a character, but really it shows that James Gunn understands Superman better than most people, because the reality is that Superman is a nature versus nurture story. Jor-El is ultimately irrelevant to Superman in his adult life, as 99% of his moral character he gets from the Kents. So the only thing that really matters is that he loved his son so much that he was willing to send him to an alien planet to save him, with the lesson of being a guiding force so that Earth doesn't end up like Krypton. Superman's birth parents aren't even really evil, they just care about their son to an extreme degree and making sure that the Kryptonian race doesn't die out. They also don't encourage Clark to just go out and rape women. That's just a lie people are spreading. They just tell him to have multiple wives. But even though they have good intentions, that doesn't make what they're suggesting right. The whole theme of the movie is about imperfections and flaws despite having good intentions. The country serving as a Palestine allegory is implied to have attacked America before, but the innocents who live there don't deserve to be genocided. Clark is idealistic to a fault, but one of his flaws is that he doesn't consider the unintended consequences of his actions and how it could possibly make a situation worse even if he simply wanted to help people. The Justice Gang means well, but are sometimes too brutal, which prevents the most peaceful outcome from being reached. Krypto, the superdog, is poorly trained, but still a fiercely loyal pet. Eve is a total bimbo who cheers on Lex for his crimes, and directly benefits from them by being his girlfriend. But she has a change of heart and helps expose Lex with her selfies. Luthor is obsessed with perfection, but denies his own imperfections, which leads him to commit acts of evil that he claims is necessary in advancing humanity. And finally, this circles back to Clark's Kryptonian family wanting him to take over Earth, but they do it from a place of love for their son and their home planet. Clark obviously rejects this since he was raised human and as a result values human life, which makes complete sense because why would he want to make the planet he's living on be more like the planet that blew up? The point of Superman isn't to make the planet that raised him into a planet that he never experienced living on, it's to pay back the planet with the same love and wisdom it raised him on for taking him in. The biggest problem I have with the twist regarding the L's isn't even the twist itself, but a certain character being revealed at the end, Kara-El or Supergirl, because if she is in this, then doesn't that contradict or at least bring into question the big plot twist? Because Kara is supposed to remember everything about her life on Krypton since she's technically older than Clark, but hasn't aged while she was frozen in her Kryptonian escape pod. So if the Kryptonians really are a bunch of conquerors, shouldn't she also be trying to take over Earth? Why didn't Supergirl tell Clark about any of this? It could be that Jor-El was the one with this plan and not all of Krypton, which Kara didn't know about or she knew and didn't want to tell him. But even if you answered that problem, you also have the problem of the robots, because if Krypton is truly made up of cruel warmongers, then why aren't they programmed to be warmongers or telling Clark to do exactly what his parents wanted him to do? I won't hold this against the film because this can be fixed with future movies, but it does need to have a satisfying explanation. And if you want to bitch about politics and say that this is somehow communist propaganda, it's really more conservative than it is leftist when you actually look at the message for what it is. It's a story that ends with a refugee renouncing where he came from because he realizes that where he came from sucks, and instead chooses to fully assimilate into the culture that actually raised him, which is America. Last I checked, leftists don't want people assimilating and becoming model American citizens because they think America is inherently bad and should be burned to the ground. But now that I've gone over the positives, it's time that we went over the negatives. At first I gave this a 7 out of 10, but after rewatching it and talking with some other people about it, I dropped that score to a 5 out of 10, because while it wasn't offensively bad by any means, there are in fact a lot of plot holes. Let's start off with Lex Luthor. I don't have an issue with him being obsessed with killing Superman, because the guy is established to be a total narcissist who can't be convinced that he's wrong about anything, and is a generational hater on the same level as Reverse Flash and Black Manta. So it makes sense for him to take extreme steps to try and kill Superman. But his plan has some avoidable holes. Namely, the big black hole that his pocket universe opens that threatens to destroy the world. His plan isn't to simply kill and humiliate Superman. It's also to rule the world because he has such a high opinion of himself that he thinks he'll be elevating humanity by doing so. And if that's the case, why is he willing to allow the world to be destroyed by a black hole? I know that he gives a reason for it, which is that Metropolis chose Superman over him, but this isn't even the case because he turned them all against him by convincing everyone that he's an alien invader. And it's a pretty glaring issue when his motivation is to rule the world. So how can you do that without a world to rule? He also had other ways to get Superman to come to him, such as the conflict he manufactured that he was going to intervene in until he opened the black hole, or simply just have Ultraman attack Metropolis again like he did at the start of the movie. He's just overcomplicating things at his own expense, which you can't have your super smart characters doing because if you write them to be among the smartest people on Earth, there's going to be an increased amount of attention placed on them. The same applies to Mr. Terrific, who also just makes dumb decisions by not telling his teammates about the black hole that has the potential to destroy the planet, and waits to do anything about it for an entire night. I also had an issue with the reasoning for why Luthor didn't just kill Superman immediately after being allowed custody of him in his private prison, because the public already hates him now, so he can just kill him and say that he tried to escape because that avoids so many problems down the line. The reasoning he gives of wanting to wait until the government questions him is also pretty weak, because he's already lying to them anyway. I doubt he had their permission to kill random civilians to torture Superman, but he still did it. There's also Jeffrey Epstein's security guard levels of incompetence with how he escapes, as none of the guards happen to be watching him as Metamorpho transforms into the goddamn sun. I'd say that was the most contrived thing to happen in the whole movie, but that gets beaten out by Jimmy Olsen's whole subplot, who just so happens to have the girlfriend of Lex Luthor have an obsessive crush on him and sends incriminating evidence of his crimes to him because Lex Luthor just so happens to not notice any of this. I also didn't find Jimmy's arc very compelling, because it essentially amounts to him going, "Oh no, I gotta clap some supermodel's cheeks at the expense of my weekend plans in exchange for the world not ending. My life fucking sucks. Nobody understands the struggles I go through. I'm going on a Jimmy Cell arc. Billions must die." Cry me a goddamn river, dude. But even though there's plenty to criticize, I'm honestly happy that it exists and it can serve as a good foundation for better stories if they manage to improve on the flaws of this one. By having a tighter script, I think they'd have a story that could stand up to scrutiny, and I'm excited to see what comes next. But those are just my thoughts, and if you have any of your own, then be sure to leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed the video, then be sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. Thank you!